The heart monitor in room 7 of Houston Methodist's ICU had been holding the same flat, unbroken tone for 11 minutes. Dr. Caldwell set down her stethoscope. She turned to the family with the careful expression doctors learn from moments like this. Composed, gentle, final. We've done everything we can. Jason Stoller stood at the foot of the bed. For $1 billion in assets. 31 hours without sleep. And not one thing he could do. His grandmother Kathy lay still against the white pillow, her hands folded, a small silver brooch catching the cold light of the room. The family exhaled together. The kind of exhale that means we are letting go. Then the door opened. A young woman stepped inside, cleaning uniform, hair pulled back, eyes red but steady. In her hand was a small cloth, carefully folded. She did not hesitate. She walked directly to the bedside, the way a person walks when they have already made their decision. Please, she said quietly. I know what this is. My grandmother taught me. No one moved fast enough to stop her. Before we go further, what state are you watching from? Drop it in the comments below. And if stories about family, faith, and the kind of courage that comes from love move you, make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell. Because this story is only just beginning, and you do not want to miss what happens next. Sharon Mathis was 23 years old, and she had been awake since 4 in the morning. That was nothing new. The early shift at Houston Methodist began at 4:30, and Sharon had not missed a single one in 11 months. She moved through the pre-dawn corridors the way she always did. Careful, quiet, invisible to the overnight staff who were too tired to notice a young woman with a mop and a steady hand. The hallways smelled the way they always did. Antiseptic, floor wax, and something underneath that Sharon had never been able to name. Something that reminded her that people came here when they had run out of other options. She didn't mind the early hours. There was a particular piece to the hospital before the day fully arrived, before the families came with their worry and their coffee cups, before the administrators filled the corridors with clipboards and purpose. In these quiet hours, it felt like a place where real things still mattered. On the inside of her locker door, there was a photograph. A woman in her 70s, strong-backed and slow-smiling, standing in a kitchen somewhere outside the city where the land was flat and the light came in sideways through old windows. Helen F. Mathis, Sharon's grandmother, the woman who had taught her, among everything else she had taught her, that real knowledge does not come with a certificate. It comes with patience, with repetition, with love. Sharon touched the photograph the way she always did, just briefly, just with one finger, before she pulled on her gloves and started her rounds. She did not know, on that particular morning, that her rounds would take her past room 7. She did not know what she would see through the glass. But her grandmother, who had spent 40 years learning which plants healed and which harmed, had always told her, "You'll know the moment when it comes, baby. You won't have to go looking for it. It will find you." Sharon had always thought that was the kind of thing grandmothers said. She was about to understand that her grandmother had meant every word. The alarm on Sharon Mathis's phone went off at 3:58 in the morning, the way it did every morning, 2 minutes before the time she had set it. She was already awake. She lay still for a moment in the dark of her apartment. A single room on the 3rd floor of a building on the east side of Houston where the hallway light had been out for 6 weeks, and the super kept promising to fix it. The ceiling above her was the same water-stained white it had always been. Outside, the city was quiet in the particular way it got in those last hours before dawn, when even Houston seemed to exhale and rest. She dressed carefully, the way her grandmother had taught her to dress for work. Not for show, for self-respect. The bus ride to Houston Methodist took 22 minutes at that hour, with no one on it but a few night shift workers and an older man who always slept against the window with his hat pulled down. Sharon sat near the back and looked out at the passing streets. The gas stations lit up like lanterns, the dark storefronts, the occasional figure moving along a sidewalk with the purposeful walk of someone who had somewhere to be before the world caught up with them. She was one of those people. She had always been one of those people. The hospital received her the way it always did at 4:27 in the morning, with fluorescent light and the low hum of machines doing their patient, tireless work. She badged in through the service entrance, changed in the locker room, and stood for a moment at her locker before closing it. On the inside of the door, held by a single piece of tape that she replaced every few weeks before it could fail, was a photograph. Helen F. Mathis looked directly at the camera with the expression she always had in photographs, as though she found the whole enterprise of being photographed slightly amusing but was willing to cooperate. Strong-backed, slow-smiling, standing in her kitchen with the yellow curtains behind her and the old wooden table that had been in the family since before anyone could remember. "Morning, Grandma," Sharon said quietly. She closed the locker and picked up her cart. The pre-dawn hospital was its own particular world, and Sharon had come to know it the way you come to know a place you move through alone. The corridors had a different quality at this hour, emptier, more honest somehow, stripped of the daytime performance of efficiency and authority. Sharon was good at her job. She was methodical and thorough, and she took a quiet, private satisfaction in leaving things cleaner than she found them. She knew which floors needed 2 passes. She knew which nurses appreciated a quick hello and which ones needed silence to hold their concentration. Nurse Patricia Odoms was at the 3rd floor station when Sharon came through, and she looked up with the warm, tired smile she always had at this hour. "Morning, Sharon. You're early. Bus was fast tonight." Patricia shook her head slowly. "I'll never understand how you do this shift and still look like a person. My grandmother always said the early hours belong to people who mean business," Sharon said, and Patricia laughed, a soft, genuine sound in the quiet corridor. Sharon moved on. She always moved on. That was the job. She was on her 2nd pass of the 4th floor corridor, her cartwheels making their familiar low sound against the tile, when she noticed the light in room 7 was different from the others. Not brighter, not louder, just different. The quality of attention inside it. She told herself not to slow down. She slowed down. Through the narrow window in the door, she could see the room clearly. An elderly woman lay in the bed, white-haired, composed even in unconsciousness, with the particular stillness of someone the machines were working very hard to keep in the world. The family around her was weeping quietly or standing in that rigid, helpless way people stood when they had run out of things to do. And at the foot of the bed, a tall man stood with his hands gripping the bed rail and his eyes fixed on the woman's face with an intensity that Sharon recognized without needing to be told what it meant. That was the look of someone who was not ready. Sharon understood that look. She had worn it herself, in a different room, in a different year, with different machines making their patient and merciless sounds. And then her eyes found the brooch. Small, silver, pinned to the woman's gown just below the left shoulder. It caught the light the way old silver does, with a warmth that newer metal doesn't have. The kind of piece that had been worn through decades of a life. Something moved through Sharon that she could not name. Not recognition exactly. The feeling that lived just underneath it. A door in her memory that she knew was there, but couldn't quite find the handle for. Her hand rose to the glass without her deciding to raise it. She stood there for a long moment. Then she picked up her cart handle and walked. Because that was the job. Because she didn't know yet. Because the memory was still assembling itself in the deep, patient dark of her mind, the way the most important things always did, slowly, carefully, and exactly on time. She finished her shift at 8:45 in the morning, clocked out, changed, and rode the bus home through the Houston rush hour with the city wide awake around her and her eyes seeing very little of it. The brooch stayed with her the entire way. By the time she turned her key in her apartment door, she had almost convinced herself it was nothing, a trick of the light, the particular vulnerability that came from working long hours in a place where people suffered. You started seeing meaning in things. Her grandmother had warned her about that too. Actually, don't go borrowing significance, baby. But don't go ignoring it either. The trick is knowing which is which. Sharon sat on the edge of her bed and closed her eyes. She thought about the woman in that room. The particular quality of her stillness, not the absence of someone already gone, but the withdrawal of someone being pulled in a direction they hadn't chosen. The white hair against the pillow. The hands folded with a dignity that no hospital gown could diminish. The tall man at the foot of the bed, gripping the rail, using every resource available to him, and finding none of them sufficient. For $1 billion, she had heard a nurse say earlier. The Stoller family. Jason Stoller's grandmother. Sharon knew the name. Everyone in Houston with a television or a newspaper knew the name. She had just never expected to be standing outside a window watching it grieve. She lay back on her bed and stared at the ceiling and let her mind do what it was trying to do. Reach backward through the years toward whatever was pulling at her. The brooch was the thread. She could feel it. A small silver thing catching the light, and underneath it, somewhere in the deep archive of her childhood, a door beginning, slowly, to give. A night. She had been very young. Her grandmother's house. A woman at the door in the dark. Sharon sat up. Her hands were trembling. She pressed them flat against her knees and breathed. In slowly, out slowly. The way Helen had taught her to breathe when something important was happening, and she needed to be present for all of it. The memory was close now. She could feel its edges. A cold night. January. Helen had been sick for days with something that went beyond fever into something frightening. Sharon had been 7 years old and had sat beside her grandmother's bed holding her hand, listening to her breathe with that wrong, labored sound, understanding for the first time in her young life that the people you loved most could be taken without warning or permission. It had been past midnight when the knock came. 3 knocks. Quiet and deliberate. Not urgent. As though the person on the other side already knew they would be let in. The woman on the porch was older. 60, perhaps more. A calm face. Careful eyes. A good coat worn with dignity. She carried a small bag. She did not introduce herself. She said simply, "I heard Helen was ill. May I come in?" And Sharon, 7 years old and frightened, had stepped back and let her in, because something about the woman made the question feel like a formality rather than a genuine uncertainty about the answer. She had sat with Helen for 3 hours. By morning the fever had broken. Helen slept deeply and evenly for the first time in days. The woman was gone before Sharon woke fully. Sharon had never known her name. She had asked Helen once, years later, and Helen had smiled the way she smiled when an answer was also a lesson. A woman who was kind, she said. That's enough to know. Sharon was sitting on the edge of her bed in her East Houston apartment, and the full weight of the memory had arrived now, complete and certain. On that woman's coat. The night she came to Helen's door in the cold and the dark without being called. A small silver brooch, catching the light from the porch. Sharon stood up. She needed to see the brooch again. She needed to be sure. And somewhere across the city, in room 7 of Houston Methodist, she understood with a cold and clarifying certainty that she was running out of time to be sure about anything. The nurses on the 4th floor had developed a quiet shorthand for Jason Stoller over the past 31 hours. He was the tall one who never sat down. The one who refilled his coffee and didn't drink it. The one who answered his phone in the corridor with his voice perfectly controlled and his free hand pressed flat against the wall, as though the wall were the only thing keeping him upright. They had seen grief in every shape this building could produce, and they recognized his particular shape of it. The grief of a man who had spent his entire adult life solving problems, who had built an organization of 4,000 people precisely so that nothing would ever be beyond his reach, and who was standing now in a corridor understanding, for the first time in decades, what it felt like to have no reach at all. He was not difficult. That was what the nurses noted most. Some people in his position became demanding, became loud, turned their fear outward onto anyone in proximity. Jason Stoller became quieter, more still, as though he were conserving something. What he was conserving, though no one in that corridor could have named it, was the memory of a woman who had never once asked to be conserved for. Kathy Stoller had raised him from the age of 9, after his parents had made choices that made raising him impossible. She had done it without announcement, without complaint, and without ever making him feel like a burden she had inherited rather than a child she had chosen. She had sat with him at a kitchen table in the house on Millbrook Drive and helped him with algebra he didn't understand, and she had attended every school event with the focused, present attention of a woman who had decided that showing up completely was the minimum acceptable standard. She had built a business alongside him when he was old enough, not because she needed to, but because she understood that the best thing she could give him was the experience of building something alongside someone who believed he was capable of it. He had one memory he returned to now, standing in the corridor with his cold coffee. Kathy at her kitchen table on the morning after the worst business decision he had ever made, a deal that had cost them both significantly, that had been his call and his error. He had come to her expecting disappointment. She had looked at him for a long moment and said, with complete steadiness, "You learned something expensive. Make sure you learn it completely, so you only have to pay for it once." Then she had poured him coffee and moved on, because that was what she did. She did not linger in the rubble of a mistake. She assessed, she learned, she moved. He needed her to move now. He needed her to open her eyes and assess and move. the way she always had, the way she had his entire life. The room was not only grief, however. His assistant Dara managed everything that arrived at the fourth floor with quiet efficiency. The calls, the flowers, the family attorney Gerald Fitch, who had appeared at 9 that morning with a yellow legal pad, he did not open, and the careful manner of a man, making himself available, without making himself intrusive. It was the other visitor who changed the temperature. Douglas Crane arrived at 11. Kathy's second cousin, a connection so distant that Jason had met him perhaps 4 times. Douglas was 61, trim, well-dressed with the deliberateness of a man who thought carefully about how he appeared, and he arrived now with an expression of somber concern that sat on his face the way a coat sits on a man who has put it on before walking through a door. He said the right things. He sat down, and then, after a respectful interval of perhaps 10 minutes, he asked Gerald Fitch a careful question about the timing of estate documentation in cases of extended medical incapacitation. The question was quiet, technically reasonable, framed with care. Gerald answered it neutrally. Jason, standing at the corridor window with his back to the room, did not turn around. But his hand, resting on the window frame, pressed slightly harder against the wood. Dr. Caldwell came to him at 11:30 with the update he had been bracing for since the previous evening. She delivered difficult information the way good doctors did, directly, without false comfort, but with enough human warmth that the directness did not become cruelty. The treatments were not holding. Kathy's systems were responding less reliably than 24 hours ago. They were not without options, but she wanted Jason to understand the realistic range of outcomes. She would want to live, he said, when the doctor finished. She has never wanted anything else from a situation except to come through it. Dr. Caldwell nodded. She touched his arm briefly and walked back down the corridor. Jason turned back toward the waiting room, where Douglas Crane was now speaking quietly to Gerald Fitch with the legal pad open and a pen in his hand. Jason watched them for a long moment. He had built $4 billion on the ability to read a room. Something in this one was wrong. He just didn't know yet what it was, or how deep it went. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment with, "I'm still here." Let's see who's truly following this story, because what happens next will change everything you think you know about who saved Kathy Stoller's life, and why. The summer Sharon turned 15, she spent 6 weeks at her grandmother's house outside Houston, and those 6 weeks became the kind of time she would measure the rest of her life against without fully realizing she was doing it. Helen F. Mathis lived on a small piece of land in the hill country east of the city, in a house that had been tended with the kind of steady, patient attention that made a place feel permanent, like it had decided to stay and meant it. The porch boards didn't creak so much as sigh underfoot. The kitchen windows let in the morning light at an angle that turned everything gold for exactly 40 minutes each day. Helen knew the 40 minutes were coming and never seemed surprised by them, but she never entirely stopped appreciating them either. Sharon had been sent for the summer because her mother was working double shifts and the apartment in the city was no place for a teenager with too much time and too little to do. Helen received her the way she received everything, without fuss, without excessive welcome, with the simple, dignified assumption that of course Sharon was here, and of course there was a place for her, and of course they would find a way to be useful to each other. "You're going to learn some things this summer," Helen told her on the first morning, setting a plate of eggs and toast in front of her with the efficiency of a woman who had been feeding people since before Sharon's mother was born. "Not because I'm going to sit you down and teach you, but because I'm going to do things and you're going to be in the room. And if you pay attention, it'll stick." Sharon had paid attention. The kitchen was where most of it happened. Helen kept her dried plants in small glass jars lined along a shelf above the window, labeled in her own handwriting, which was small and precise and slightly slanted, as though the letters were leaning into a wind only they could feel. There were perhaps 30 jars. Some Sharon recognized. Some she didn't. Helen never made a ceremony of the shelf. She simply used it, the way she used her cast iron skillet or her good scissors, as a tool that belonged to the work of keeping people well. One afternoon in July, the heat outside pressing against the windows like something with weight, Helen brought down a particular jar and set it on the table between them. The plant inside was dried to a pale gray-green, its leaves small and slightly curled at the edges. "You know this one?" Helen asked. Sharon studied it. "No, ma'am." "You will." Helen sat down across from her. "This one's not for cooking, and it's not for every day. You'll know the situations it belongs to because they won't look like anything else. The body gets confused sometimes. Forgets what it's supposed to be doing. This helps remind it. Sharon looked at the jar, then at her grandmother. How do you know it works? Because my mother showed me, and her mother showed her, and somewhere back along the line a woman figured it out the hard way and made sure it didn't die with her. Helen folded her hands on the table. That's how most of the real things get passed down. Not in books. Not in schools. Person to person. Hand to hand. You understand? Yes, ma'am, Sharon said. Good. Helen tapped the jar once with one finger. Now I'll show you the preparation. Watch everything. Ask questions after. She was precise. That was what Sharon remembered most. Years later, not the warmth of it, though there was warmth, but the precision. Helen did not approximate. She gave exact amounts and exact times and exact conditions. And when Sharon asked why such specificity mattered, Helen looked at her with the patient expression she reserved for questions that answered themselves. Because someone will need this, and you'll be the only one there, she said. That is not the moment for approximately. She wrote the preparation down afterward in her notebook, the old one with the brown cover that lived in the kitchen drawer, and she made Sharon read it back to her twice. Not for showing off, Helen said, closing the notebook and looking at Sharon with the full, direct attention she gave to things that mattered. Not for impressing anybody. Not for waving around in rooms where people with certificates will look right through you like you've got nothing worth hearing. This is for when everything else has stopped working and someone still needs help. You keep this, and you keep it right, and one day it'll matter in ways you cannot yet imagine. Sharon had kept it. She had kept it the way she kept everything her grandmother gave her. Carefully, quietly, without knowing exactly what she was saving it for. Sitting on the edge of her bed in her Houston apartment 18 years later, with a memory pushing hard against the inside of her chest, and the full weight of what she now knew beginning to settle over her like weather, she was beginning to understand that her grandmother had always known this day was coming. The question that followed her into sleep that night was the one she couldn't yet answer. How? Sharon did not sleep well when she got home the following evening. She lay down on her bed and closed her eyes, and the tiredness was real. 2 long shifts in 2 days, the particular exhaustion of a body that had been running on alertness and purpose rather than rest. But underneath the tiredness was something that would not settle. Her mind kept returning to the same place, the way a tongue returns to a sore tooth. Not because it helps, but because it cannot seem to stop. She got up at midnight and stood in her small kitchen and made tea she didn't drink. She stood at the window and watched the street below for a while. A man walking alone, a convenience store lit up on the corner, the ordinary, unhurried life of a Houston night that didn't know or care that somewhere across the city a woman was dying in a room full of machines that were running out of answers. She thought about her job. She had 11 months of perfect attendance. A supervisor who had twice mentioned a possible promotion to shift lead. She was saving, carefully, slowly, the way you saved when the margins were narrow, for the nursing school application fees, and then the program itself, and then the years of work that would follow it. She had a plan. It was not a fast plan or a glamorous plan, but it was hers, and she had built it with the same patient precision her grandmother had used for everything that mattered. Walking into that room uninvited, with no credential and no authority and a folded cloth that no hospital protocol had ever sanctioned, that was not part of the plan. She turned away from the window. She knelt beside her bed. The tin had been under there for 4 years, since the day after Helen's funeral. It was an old biscuit tin, faded and beloved, and the inside smelled the way it had always smelled, dried herbs and old paper, and something underneath both that Sharon had no name for except her. She lifted the lid. The contents were familiar. 3 small cloth pouches, each tied with kitchen twine. A folded piece of brown paper with measurements written in Helen's handwriting. 2 dried sprigs. And beneath all of it, in the bottom corner of the tin, a letter she had noticed every time she opened the tin and never once touched. Folded twice. Sealed with a small piece of tape gone brittle at the edges. Addressed, in Helen's small precise hand, to whoever finds themselves needing this. Sharon had always told herself it wasn't time. That it wasn't meant for her. That she wasn't ready. She picked it up. The tape gave way without resistance, as though it had been waiting. Helen's handwriting was unhurried and exact, and Sharon read slowly, the way the letter seemed to ask to be read. It began without preamble. Helen described a specific kind of crisis, not a name, not a diagnosis, but a constellation of signs laid out with the same precision she had used at the kitchen table 23 years ago. The way the body presented, the particular rhythm the machines would show, the way the face looked, and the hands, and the specific quality of stillness that was different from ordinary sleep. She described it in 2 paragraphs. With each sentence, Sharon felt the hair on her arms rise slowly and steadily, the way it rose before a storm. Helen was describing the woman in room 7. Exactly. Precisely. Without having ever been in that room. The preparation followed, the same one from the brown paper, but with additions Sharon had not seen before. Exact amounts. Exact timing. A specific way of folding the cloth. Helen had drawn a small diagram in the margin with the neat economy of a woman who understood that clarity was its own form of kindness. A woman whose knowledge had never been respected by any room with credentials on the wall, but who had spent a lifetime being right anyway. And at the bottom of the page, below everything else, in slightly larger letters, as though Helen had lifted her pen and made a decision. You will know when it's time, baby. Don't be afraid to be seen. Sharon sat with the letter for a long time. She thought about what it meant for a grandmother to write her granddaughter a message for a moment she would never witness. To prepare the remedy and write the instructions and fold the letter and place it in the tin and trust. With the deep, unwavering trust of a woman who had spent her whole life being right about what mattered, that the right person would find it when it was needed. She thought about the nurses who had redirected her, the assistant who had looked through her, the front desk volunteer who had forgotten, every credentialed person in that building who had been given every advantage she had not been given, and who had arrived, despite all of it, at the same place. We've done everything we can. And here was Sharon Mathis, a 23-year-old cleaning shift employee sitting on the floor of an East Houston apartment at midnight, holding the one thing that might change that sentence. She reached under the bed and pulled out the cloth. She began to fold it exactly as the diagram showed, precisely, unhurriedly, the way Helen had taught her to do every important thing. Her hands were steady. What she did not yet understand, what she would not understand until she was standing at Kathy Stoller's bedside with the room erupting around her, was not just how Helen had known the symptoms. It was how Helen had known that Sharon would be the one holding this letter. That Sharon would be the one in that hospital. That Sharon would be the one close enough to act. Unless Helen had known something about Kathy Stoller that Sharon didn't. Unless the connection between those 2 women ran much deeper than a single visit on a January night. She was back at the hospital by 4:28 the next morning. She had badged in, changed, and begun her rounds with the careful efficiency that had always been her professional armor. But the cloth was in her bag, in her locker, and she was aware of it the way you are aware of something important you have set down in a safe place. A low, steady hum of knowing. At 6:15, during her break, she sat in the small staff room with her phone and searched the name. Stoller. Houston. Family. The results came back immediately. The Stoller name was not obscure. She found the press materials within 30 seconds, a profile from a Houston business magazine, 3 years old. She scrolled past Jason Stoller's official portrait, past the corporate offices, past a charity gala photograph. And then she stopped. The caption read, Kathy T. Stoller, co-founder, at the Stoller Group's 40th anniversary celebration. The woman in the image was younger than the woman in room 7. This photograph was perhaps 15 years old, but the bearing was identical. The same composure. The same quality of presence, concentrated and self-contained. She was smiling at whoever had taken the photograph with the warm, direct expression of a woman who had nothing to prove to anyone and had arrived at that understanding a long time ago. And on her lapel, exactly where it had been on the hospital gown, the silver brooch caught the light. Sharon looked at it for a long time. The memory arrived all at once, the way memories do when they have been waiting long enough. Not in pieces but complete, like a room suddenly lit. She had been 7 years old. January. Cold enough that the heating in her grandmother's house had been running for 3 days without stopping. Helen had been sick since before Christmas with something that had started as a fever and become something more frightening over the days that followed. The clinic was 40 minutes away. There had been no car that week. Sharon had sat beside her grandmother's bed the way children sit when they are trying to be useful and do not know how, holding Helen's hand, listening to her breathe with that wrong, labored sound. It had been past midnight when the knock came. 3 knocks. Quiet and deliberate. Not urgent. As though the person on the other side of the door had known they were expected. The woman who stood on the porch was older, 60, perhaps more, with a calm face and careful eyes and a coat that had been good once and was still worn with dignity. She carried a small bag. She did not introduce herself. She said, "I heard Helen was ill. May I come in?" Sharon had stepped back and let her in because there was something about the woman that made the question feel like a formality. She sat with Helen for 3 hours. Sharon dozed in the corner chair and woke to find the woman still there, still steady, her hands moving with the same quiet precision Sharon now recognized, because she had watched those same hands described in a letter at midnight, and she had spent a summer learning those same movements at a kitchen table with the July light coming in gold through a window. By morning, the fever had broken. The woman was gone before Sharon woke completely. Sharon was sitting now in a supply closet on the 3rd floor of Houston Methodist. She did not remember walking there. The door was closed. A pull chain light threw pale yellow over the shelves around her. She sat on an overturned bucket and pressed both hands flat against her knees and breathed. In. Slowly. Out. Slowly. The woman who had come to Helen's door on the worst night of their lives had been wearing Kathy Stoller's brooch, which meant that Kathy Stoller had come, personally, to a small house in the Texas Hill Country, in the middle of January, in the middle of the night, without being called. And Helen, who had always known things in that patient, inexplicable way of hers, had written a letter addressed to whoever finds themselves needing this, and had left it in the tin, and had waited. Sharon sat with this for 4 minutes. She counted them. Then she stood up, straightened her uniform, and opened the door. She knew what she was walking into. The question she couldn't answer, the one that followed her down the corridor and back to her cart and through the rest of that long, careful morning, was why. A woman of Kathy Stoller's world did not drive alone to a small house in the hill country at midnight without a reason. What had connected them, Helen Mathis and Kathy Stoller, in the first place? And who else, in that hospital right now, might have a reason to not want that question answered? She started with the most reasonable thing she could think of. At 7:40 in the morning, during a quiet moment at the 4th floor nurse's station, Sharon approached Nurse Carol, a woman who had worked the overnight shift for as long as Sharon had been at the hospital, and who had always acknowledged her with the particular warmth of someone who understood that the people who cleaned the floors were the reason the floors were clean. "Carol," she said quietly, "I know this is an unusual thing to ask, but the family in room 7, the Stollers, I have information that might be relevant to Mrs. Stoller's condition. Is there any way to get a message to her grandson?" Carol looked at her with genuine kindness and genuine helplessness in equal measure. "Honey, that family has a full communications block on their floor. Everything goes through their personal assistant. I can't approach them directly any more than you can. Is there a way to reach the assistant? Front desk can try, but I'll be honest with you, they're not letting much through right now." Sharon thanked her and moved on. At 8:15 she wrote a note at the front desk. Not everything, because everything would have sounded like the words of someone who should be escorted outside, but enough. "My name is Sharon Mathis. I work the morning cleaning shift. I believe I may have relevant information about Mrs. Stoller's condition. I am asking for 5 minutes. Please." She included her phone number. The volunteer coordinator, a man named Mr. Ellison, took it with both hands and the gravity of someone entrusted with something important. By 10 o'clock she had heard nothing. At 10:30 she passed the volunteer desk. Mr. Ellison was helping a family with parking validation. He looked up, met her eyes, and in the microsecond before his expression organized itself into professional pleasantness, she saw it, the fractional guilty recognition of a person who had intended to do something and had not yet done it. The note had not been delivered. "I'll get it up there this morning," he said, before she said anything. "Thank you," Sharon said, because what else was there to say? At noon she took her lunch break near the 4th floor family waiting area, which was technically a public corridor. She sat with her lunch bag and her phone and waited with the patience of someone who had learned that patience was sometimes the only door that hadn't been locked yet. She saw Dara, Jason Stoller's assistant, move through the corridor twice. Efficient, focused, moving like someone whose entire job was to prevent exactly the kind of unscheduled interaction Sharon was hoping for. The second time she passed, Her eyes moved over Sharon the way eyes moved over furniture, registering presence, assigning category, moving on. Sharon thought about standing up. She thought about saying her name clearly, loudly, and watching what happened. She thought about her 11 months of perfect attendance. About the shift lead mention. About the nursing school application sitting in a folder on her phone, half completed, waiting for the fee she had been saving toward for 2 years. She stayed in her chair. At 1:15, a floor supervisor she didn't recognize told her, politely but without ambiguity, that break time required the designated staff areas. She gathered her lunch bag and went. In the corridor near the elevator, she passed Douglas Crane. He was on his phone, speaking in a low voice, and he did not look up as she passed. But she caught a fragment, 3 words in the precise, careful tone of a man who was managing something, not grieving something. Not yet confirmed. Sharon kept walking. She filed it the way her grandmother had taught her to file things that didn't yet make sense. Carefully, and near the front, where it would be easy to find when the rest of the picture arrived. The deterioration report reached the corridor at 6:40 in the evening. Sharon had volunteered for the late extension without examining her reasons. She was in the 4th floor corridor when she heard it. Dr. Caldwell's voice, low and measured, speaking to a resident. "We're running out of time. Her systems are responding less and less. I want the family prepared." A door opened and closed. Footsteps moved away toward room 7. Sharon stood very still with her hand on her cart. She thought about every door she had knocked on that day. The nurse who couldn't help. The note that was never delivered. The assistant who looked through her. The supervisor who redirected her. A full day of reasonable attempts, and every single one had led to the same wall. Politely constructed, firmly maintained, with no door in it for a woman with her job title and her address and her cleaning cart. She rode the elevator down and walked through the lobby and pushed through the heavy front doors into the Houston evening, where the heat hit her like a held breath finally released. She sat on the low concrete bench outside the entrance and put her bag in her lap and looked at the parking lot for a long time. She was not angry. That surprised her slightly. She had expected anger and found instead something quieter and more certain. The specific clarity that arrives when you have exhausted every option except the one you were afraid of from the beginning. She unzipped her bag. The folded cloth was there, where it had been all day. She thought about Kathy Stoller driving alone to a small house in the Texas Hill Country in the middle of a January night, without being called, because someone needed help, and she had what was needed, and she did not let the difference in their worlds stop her from crossing the distance between them. Sharon looked at the cloth for a long moment. Then she stood up, put her bag over her shoulder, and walked back through the front doors. She was going to room 7. Not through the front desk. Not through a note. Not through any door that required someone else's permission to open. Tonight. The hours between 7 and 11 had a particular quality that Sharon would remember afterward, not as a sequence of events, but as a single sustained act of waiting. She had told the shift supervisor she was available for the late extension, and they had needed her, and she had taken it. She moved through the hospital's late evening rhythms, the dinner trays returning, the visitor hours ending, the building slowly contracting into its nighttime self, with the outward steadiness of a woman doing her job and the inward stillness of someone who has made a decision and is now simply waiting for the moment it requires her. She mopped the 2nd floor corridor. She restocked the supply cart on 3. She exchanged quiet words with the night nurses she knew. She did not say anything to any of them about what was in her bag or what she intended. She was waiting for the exact right second. It announced itself at 11:47. She heard it before she saw anything. A change in the building's ambient sound that she felt in her chest before her mind identified it. An alarm, yes, but not the routine kind. This one had a different character. Urgent and sustained, and overlapping with the sudden percussion of running feet and voices trying very hard not to become panicked. She knew that sound. 11 months of early morning shifts taught you the hospital's vocabulary. This one meant the margin had run out. She was already moving. The 4th floor. Room 7. She took the stairs because the elevator would cost her 30 seconds she did not have. She pushed through the stairwell door and the sound hit her fully. 2 alarms running together. The intercom paging Dr. Caldwell by name with the cadence that meant immediately. And she turned toward the ICU corridor and walked fast, and did not run because running would stop her before she got there. The The security guard was posted at the ICU entrance the way he always was. A large, quiet man named Thomas whom Sharon knew by sight and by the occasional nod in the corridor. He stepped forward when he saw her coming, one hand rising in the automatic gesture of his training. "Ma'am, this area is restricted. I know what's happening to her." Sharon stopped 2 feet from him and looked directly at him. Her voice was clear and unhurried and completely steady. "I know what's wrong and I know how to help. Please, give me 30 seconds. Thomas looked at her. In the 4 seconds that followed, she watched his expression move through surprise, doubt, protocol, and the specific human hesitation of a person being asked to decide something too large for his job description. She thought about what she was trading. Her job, 11 months of perfect attendance and a shift lead possibility, and a nursing school savings fund, and the careful, narrow plan she had built with so little and protected so well. All of it, against a woman she had never met, in a room she had no authority to enter. She thought about Helen's letter. "Don't be afraid to be seen." Sharon went around him. She heard him say something behind her. She did not stop. The room was controlled chaos in the way that only well-trained people in crisis produced. Everything purposeful, nothing wasted, and underneath the purpose a tautness that meant they were working against something that was winning. Dr. Caldwell was at the bedside with 2 residents. A nurse managed the monitors with the focused intensity of someone reading a language in real time. Equipment had been moved. The overhead light was very bright. Jason Stoller stood against the wall to the left of the door. He was not the composed, sleepless man Sharon had observed through glass for 2 days. He was pale in the way people went pale when the blood went somewhere the body needed it more. His arms hung at his sides. His face had the open, undefended quality of a person who had stopped performing anything at all because there was nothing left to perform for. He was watching his grandmother die. He had $4 billion and 31 years of building and solving and achieving, and he was standing against a wall because there was nothing left to build or solve or achieve. The machines were the only ones still working, and the machines were losing. Kathy lay in the bed with the stillness from Helen's letter, not the stillness of sleep, but the particular withdrawal of a body being called somewhere it had not yet agreed to go. The silver brooch was still on her gown. It caught the overhead light the same way it had caught the corridor light 2 mornings ago, when all of this had begun. When a young woman pushing a cleaning cart had stopped outside a window and felt something move through her that she couldn't name. A doctor turned and saw Sharon and said something sharp. A nurse moved to intercept her. Sharon reached the bedside. She set her bag down. She was aware of the voices and the hands and the monitors and Jason Stoller's eyes finding her from across the bed, too exhausted and too desperate to be simple confusion, but not too far gone to be paying attention. She was aware of all of it, and she set all of it to one side with the same quiet deliberateness with which her grandmother had set a jar on a kitchen table and said, "Now watch everything." She lifted the cloth. She thought of Helen in the kitchen with the July light coming through the window. She thought of a woman on a porch in January, calm and certain, who had come without being called because someone needed help. She thought of a letter written for a moment its author would never see, left in a tin under a bed for a granddaughter who hadn't yet understood what she was being trusted with. She thought of every door that had been closed to her in this building, every redirected note and forgotten message, and look that assigned her a category and moved on. And she thought, with a clarity that was the quietest and most certain thing she had ever felt in her life, that her grandmother had been right. Real knowledge does not come with a certificate. It comes with patience, with repetition, with love. With a woman who drove alone through the cold dark to a house she had never been told the address of, because someone needed help and she had what was needed and she believed that was enough. Her hands were completely steady. The cloth opened. The room held its breath. The herb touched Kathy Stoller's lips at 11:51 in the evening. It was not a dramatic gesture. Sharon did not announce it or look around the room for permission. She simply did what her grandmother had shown her, with the same quiet exactness with which Helen had done everything that mattered. Carefully, completely, without performance. The preparation met its purpose. Sharon stepped back. Dr. Caldwell's hand closed around her arm. Firm. Professional. Not unkind. "You need to step back right now." Sharon had already stepped back. The monitor changed at 11:53. Not dramatically. Not the sudden cinematic reversal of a body recalled from the edge by a single miraculous intervention. It was quieter than that, and in some ways more profound for its quietness. A gradual, measurable shift in the line's character. A steadying. A movement in the direction of continuity rather than conclusion. The residents saw it first. One of them said something low to Dr. Caldwell. Dr. Caldwell looked at the monitor for a long moment. Then she looked at Sharon. Then she looked back at the monitor with the expression of a physician who had spent 20 years building a professional relationship with certainty, and who was now standing in the presence of something that sat slightly outside that relationship, and who was too honest and too good at her job to pretend otherwise. "That's not," she said, quietly and almost to herself, and then she stopped. The unfinished sentence hung in the air of the room. "Get me the updated panel," she said to the room, her voice now fully professional again. "All of it. Right now." The team mobilized with a renewed urgency that had a different quality from the urgency of 1147. Not the urgency of closing down, but the urgency of an opening that had appeared without explanation and needed to be met before it narrowed again. Hands moved. Voices exchanged information in the clipped shorthand of people who had trained for this kind of sudden reversal of momentum. Kathy Stoller's chest rose and fell again. The silver brooch caught the light. Thomas, the security guard, was waiting in the doorway. He escorted Sharon out with the same large, quiet manner he brought to everything, and she went without resistance, because there was nothing left in the room that required her to stay. Whatever was going to happen now belonged to the people with the credentials and the equipment. She had done the one thing she had come to do. The corridor outside the ICU was very bright and very still. Sharon stood against the wall and closed her eyes. She was aware of a trembling in her hands that had begun somewhere in the last few minutes and was only now making itself known. Not fear, but the body's way of releasing what it had been holding for 2 days. The door opened behind her. Jason Stoller stepped into the corridor. He had followed her out with the deliberate, slightly unsteady movement of a man operating on 33 hours without sleep and the acute aftermath of watching something terrible begin to reverse itself without warning or explanation. He stopped a few feet away and looked at her, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time, with the full attention of a man who was accustomed to seeing everything in a room except the person cleaning it. He took in the uniform, the bag, the way she stood, not apologetic, not defiant, but simply present, with the deep, quiet settledness of someone who had carried something a long distance and had finally set it down in the right place. He was quiet for a long moment. "Who are you?" he asked. His voice held no authority in it right now. No boardroom weight. Just a man asking a question he genuinely did not know the answer to. Sharon looked at him steadily. "My grandmother knew yours," she said. "I think she would have wanted me to be here." Something moved through Jason Stoller's face. It began as confusion and passed through something more complicated, recognition without full understanding. The expression of a person who has been handed a key before being shown the door it opens. "Your grandmother," he said slowly. "Helen Mathis," Sharon said. "She lived outside the city. She passed 4 years ago." The name registered. She could see it. A small, involuntary stillness in his expression, a fractional pause that meant the name was not entirely unknown to him, even if the full connection hadn't assembled yet. Before he could speak again, Dr. Caldwell appeared in the doorway. "Mr. Stoller." Her voice was careful and precise. "Your grandmother is stabilizing. I need to speak with you about some of the panel results. There are elements I'd like to discuss with you privately." The word privately landed in the corridor with a weight that Sharon felt in her chest. Jason looked at the doctor, then back at Sharon. Then, just before he turned to follow Dr. Caldwell, he reached into his jacket pocket and held out a card. "Don't go anywhere," he said. "I mean that." He followed the doctor through the door. Sharon stood alone in the corridor, holding the card. The building hummed its quiet nighttime hum around her. She reached into her bag and found the remedy tin by feel and held it the way she had held it on 100 quiet nights. Not for what was in it, but for what it meant. Kathy Stoller was alive. That was enough for now. But the panel results that required a private conversation, delivered in the careful voice physicians used when the information was not just medical, but also something else, something with edges. Sharon did not know what they contained. She thought about Douglas Crane, somewhere in this building right now, with his legal pad and his careful questions about estate timing and the grief that had never quite reached his eyes. She thought about the fragment she had overheard in the corridor, not yet confirmed. She thought about what those 3 words meant if the thing being waited on was not a medical outcome, but something else entirely. She thought about what it meant that Kathy Stoller had driven alone to a small house in the Texas Hill Country in the middle of January. Not sent someone. Not arranged a delivery. Gone herself, in the dark, without being called, because Helen Mathis had needed help and Kathy had what was needed. 2 women from entirely different worlds, connected by a kindness that had traveled through decades and returned. Through a granddaughter with a cleaning cart and a tin under her bed, and a letter she had almost never opened. On the exact night it was needed most. Helen had known. Not approximately. Not as a feeling. She had known, with the precise and patient certainty she brought to everything that mattered, that this moment was coming. That Sharon would be there. That the preparation would be needed. Which meant Helen had known something about what was threatening Kathy Stoller, and had spent years making sure the right person would be ready when it arrived. Kathy was alive, but she was not yet awake. And until she was, the answers lived in the silence between what had happened and what was still coming. In a private medical conversation down the hall, in a legal pad with questions written in it, in a connection between 2 grandmothers that no one in this building yet understood, and in a young woman standing in a hospital corridor at midnight, holding a card and a tin and everything her grandmother had trusted her to carry. The door to room 7 was closed. Sharon looked at it for a long moment. Then she found a chair in the corridor, sat down, and waited. She was not going anywhere. If this story moved you, if you saw someone you love in Kathy, or someone you know in Sharon, or something of your own grandmother in Helen, leave a comment below and tell us. Share this with someone who needs to hear that the knowledge women passed down through generations is real and powerful and never wasted. And subscribe, so you're here when Kathy Stoller opens her eyes, because when she does, everything that happened in that room is going to change for everyone involved. The truth about what connected Helen Mathis and Kathy Stoller across all those years is still waiting to be told. Don't miss it.